The war room on the 40th floor had gone completely silent, and silence, in a room built for noise, was the most frightening sound of all. Every screen along the east wall had frozen mid-refresh, rows of factory throughput numbers locked at 0, and the master status board that had blinked green for 6 straight years now pulsed a single word in dead red letters: offline. Charlotte Reed stood at the head of the table, with her palm flat against the cold glass of the conference display, as if pressure alone might force the numbers back to life. Behind her, one of the consultants, a young man in a $4,000 suit, who had told her 3 weeks earlier that the old infrastructure was held together with duct tape and nostalgia, hurled his laptop onto the table so hard the shell cracked down the middle. Nobody said anything. 4 factories, $140 million in quarterly output, and 1,100 paychecks were sitting behind a black screen that none of his hand-picked experts could bring back. Charlotte's throat tightened around a name she had not let herself say out loud in 30 days. To find out who she would have to go back to, and what it would cost her to ask, stay until the very end. If you've ever watched someone brilliant get pushed aside for someone merely expensive, you already know exactly how this story is going to hurt before it heals. Tell us in the comments if these overlooked hero stories find you too. And maybe, before we go back to where it all began, it's worth asking out loud what so many of you are already thinking. Should companies trust 20 years of quiet, hands-on experience over a shiny new consulting contract with a big name attached to it? Or does the industry actually need young, formally trained talent to move forward at all? 3 years ago, none of this existed. 3 years ago, the 40th floor was quiet for an entirely different reason. Because everything was working exactly the way Ethan Brooks had built it to work. Ethan Brooks did not look like the man who held 4 factories together. He was 51 years old, wore the same gray fleece every winter, and drove a truck with 210,000 miles on it that he fixed himself in the driveway on Saturdays, with his daughter Lily handing him wrenches. At Halbrook Industrial, he was officially titled Senior Systems Engineer, but unofficially, he was the reason the company's aging production control software, a patchwork system he had rebuilt from the ground up 11 years earlier, had never gone down for longer than 4 minutes at a stretch. He had written the core scheduling logic himself, back when the company was half its current size, and he had kept it alive through 6 acquisitions, 3 failed vendor migrations, and 1 attempted company-wide overhaul that he had quietly talked the board out of because he knew, better than anyone in that boardroom, exactly how fragile the underlying architecture actually was beneath its reliable surface. He rarely spoke in meetings. He noticed things: a coolant valve running 4 degrees warmer than spec, a shipment manifest with a decimal error nobody else caught, a subcontractor's invoice that didn't match delivered tonnage, and he fixed them quietly, without ever asking for credit. His silence was not shyness. 6 years earlier, Lily's mother had left without warning, and Ethan had made a decision that shaped every year since. He would never again let his name, his opinions, or his pride be worth more than his daughter's stability. He kept his head down, cashed his paycheck, and made sure Lily never once felt the ground shift beneath her the way his own had shifted. Charlotte Reed became CEO of Halbrook Industrial 14 months before the crash, inheriting a company under enormous pressure from its largest client, a national retailer threatening to pull a $400 million annual contract unless Halbrook modernized its production reporting within the year. Charlotte was 39, whip-smart, exhausted in a way she never let the board see, and entirely convinced that the fastest way to prove Halbrook belonged in the modern era was to bring in outside expertise that looked the part: credentialed, confident, expensive. She was not cruel. She was cornered, the way executives often are, by a board that wanted transformation measured in press releases rather than years, and by her own fear that being the first woman to run Halbrook meant she could not afford to look like she was clinging to the old way of doing things. Into that fear walked Marcus Doyle, a polished magnetic principal from a consulting firm called Ironbridge Systems, who told Charlotte in their very first meeting that Halbrook's legacy dependency on a single aging engineer was, in his words, the single greatest unmanaged risk on your balance sheet. He said it kindly. He said it with a slide deck. And Charlotte, who had never once sat down with Ethan Brooks to understand what his system actually did, or how it had held 4 factories together for a decade, believed him completely. Somewhere far below Marcus Doyle's $40,000 a month retainer, Ethan kept working exactly as he always had, unaware that his name had already begun appearing in strategy documents as a line item to be phased out. He had noticed, in the weeks before, that requests for system access from an unfamiliar consulting domain had started appearing in the server logs, quiet and unexplained, the way a draft under a door tells you a window has been left open somewhere in the house. He mentioned it once briefly to his supervisor, who told him not to worry about it. He did not push. He never pushed. And 3,000 miles away from the 40th floor, in a modest 2-bedroom house with a workbench in the garage, Lily Brooks, 12 years old and sharper than most people gave her credit for, had no idea that in exactly 19 days, her father was going to come home early on a Tuesday afternoon and sit very quietly at the kitchen table without saying a word for almost 20 minutes. The dismissal happened on a Tuesday. In Charlotte's office, with the door closed and the blinds drawn, which Ethan would later understand was meant as a kindness, though it had not felt like one at the time. Charlotte had rehearsed the words with HR the night before, phrases like restructuring the systems function and bringing in specialized modernization expertise. And this isn't a reflection of your contributions. Phrases built to soften an edge that cut, just as deep no matter how it was worded. Ethan sat across from her with his hands folded in his lap, and he did not argue, did not raise his voice, did not point out that he had personally rebuilt the exact scheduling core that Ironbridge's own onboarding documents referenced without understanding. He asked one question: who would be maintaining the failover protocols during the transition? And when Charlotte admitted she wasn't certain, he nodded once, thanked her for the years, and asked only that his final paycheck be processed on time, because he had a daughter at home who depended on it. Charlotte would replay that nod for months without understanding, until much later, exactly how loud it had actually been. Marcus Doyle made sure the transition looked seamless from the outside. Ironbridge brought in 6 senior consultants, 2 data architects, and a project lead who gave confident presentations full of terms like modular resiliency and cloud-native failover. And for the first several weeks, nothing broke, because nothing had needed touching yet. Charlotte told the board it was the smoothest technology transition in company history. She told herself the same thing every night, quietly, as though repeating it enough might make the unease in her stomach go away. That unease had a name, though she would not admit it to herself yet. She had let a man who had never once missed a deadline in 11 years walk out of the building over a slide deck from someone who had never actually opened the system he was criticizing. Somewhere in the building, a facilities coordinator named Renee Alvarez, who had worked 2 doors down from Ethan for 9 years, watched the whole thing happen and said nothing, because she had bills of her own and a survivor's instinct that told her silence was safer than sympathy. She would carry that silence like a stone in her pocket for the next month. Ethan drove home that Tuesday afternoon and told Lily gently over dinner that he wasn't going back to Halbrook anymore, and that they were going to figure out the next chapter together. Lily, who had spent years watching her father fix things that other people had given up on, the neighbor's dryer, the church van, the ancient furnace in their own basement, asked him a question that would end up changing both their lives. Why didn't he just open his own repair shop, the way he always talked about doing someday? Ethan laughed the first real laugh he'd had in weeks and told her someday had a way of never actually arriving unless somebody made you show up for it. 3 weeks later, with severance money and a small loan from a credit union that had known his family for 15 years, Ethan signed a lease on a narrow storefront 2 miles from their house, hung a hand-painted sign that read Brooks Repair, honest work, honest price, and started fixing washing machines, generators, and the occasional industrial motor for small manufacturers who couldn't afford the big national repair chains. Lily worked the counter after school, kept the books in a spiral notebook better than most accountants could have managed, and for the first time in 6 years, Ethan Brooks came home every night without the low hum of anxiety he'd carried for a decade, the anxiety of being the only person standing between a company and its own collapse. He didn't know it yet, but somewhere on the 40th floor of Halbrook Industrial, That same collapse was quietly assembling itself, piece by piece, exactly the way he had once feared it might. If you've ever been the person who kept something running quietly for years, only to be shown the door the moment someone louder and more expensive walked in, you already know the particular ache in this part of the story. Tell us in the comments if you've ever felt unseen or underestimated the way Ethan was, because so many of you watching have lived exactly this. 3 weeks would pass in relative peace, the shop's little bell ringing over the door more often than Ethan expected, before a single overlooked line of failover code, quietly deprioritized in an Iron Bridge migration document, would begin the countdown toward the morning. Everything at Halbrook Industrial went dark at once. The first sign of trouble was small enough that almost nobody noticed it. A scheduling delay of 11 minutes at the Ohio plant, blamed on a network hiccup. A batch report that came out with duplicate entries, quietly corrected by an overnight technician who didn't think it worth mentioning. Charlotte noticed only because she had made a habit, since Ethan's departure, of reading the nightly operations summary herself instead of trusting the dashboard, a habit she couldn't fully explain even to herself. Small inconsistencies kept surfacing, an inventory count off by 400 units here, a shift schedule that had to be manually rebuilt there. Each one explained away by Marcus Doyle with the same calm, confident language he'd used in every meeting since he arrived. Charlotte began to notice that his explanations, while smooth, never actually named the underlying cause. They described symptoms. They never touched the disease. It was Renee Alvarez, the facilities coordinator, who had stayed silent the day Ethan left, who finally cracked open the guilt she'd been carrying. She came to Charlotte's office unannounced on a Thursday evening, when most of the floor had gone home, and told her something she had never said out loud to anyone. That in Ethan's last month, he had quietly flagged an unusual access pattern coming from an external consulting domain weeks before Iron Bridge's official contract even began, and that his concern had been waved off by a manager eager to look cooperative with the incoming consultants. Renee didn't know what it meant technically. She only knew that Ethan had raised his hand once, quietly, the way he always did, and that nobody had listened. Charlotte sat with that information for a long time after Renee left, staring at the framed company anniversary photo on her wall. The one from 6 years ago, where Ethan stood at the far edge of the frame, half out of the shot, exactly the way he preferred it. Charlotte did something she had never done in 14 months as CEO. She drove to Ethan's neighborhood herself, alone, without her assistant, without an appointment, and sat outside a small storefront with a hand-painted sign for nearly 10 minutes before she found the nerve to go in. Ethan was underneath a generator when she walked through the door, and Lily, working the counter, recognized her instantly from a news photo and went very still. When Ethan finally stood up, wiping his hands on a rag, Charlotte offered him everything she thought might work. His old title back, a raise, a signing bonus, a public apology drafted by legal. Ethan listened to all of it without interrupting, the way he always listened, and then said the only thing he actually wanted. An honest admission, spoken plainly, that letting him go had been a mistake made out of fear rather than fact. Not a corporate statement, just the truth, said to his face. Charlotte, who had spent 14 months being told never to admit fault out loud, felt something in her chest crack open, and for the first time since taking the job, she said it. She had been wrong. She had let a slide deck outweigh a decade of proof, and she was sorry. Ethan agreed to come in as a consultant, on his own terms, but not before a second crisis hit while they were still standing in that repair shop. Charlotte's phone rang with the news that the Georgia plant's backup generators had just failed during a routine test, meaning that if the main system went down now, there would be no failover at all, anywhere. This is the part of the story where so many of you have strong feelings, and it's worth saying out loud. Should Ethan have pushed harder, made more noise, insisted on being heard the moment he first noticed the strange access logs, or was staying quiet, protecting his paycheck and his daughter's stability? Actually the wiser choice for a man with nobody else to catch him if he fell. 1 month would pass, tense and quiet, Ethan commuting between his repair shop and Halbrook's server room in the evenings after Lily went to bed, before the fragile patchwork holding the system together would finally give way completely, on an ordinary Thursday morning that neither Charlotte nor Ethan would ever describe as ordinary again. The system did not fail quietly. It failed everywhere at once. At 9:14 on a Thursday morning, every factory floor from Ohio to Georgia to Texas losing production control within the same 90-second window. Exactly as Ethan had privately warned Charlotte it eventually would if the failover gap wasn't patched before peak load season. Ironbridge's senior consultants, the same team that had once called Ethan's architecture duct tape and nostalgia, spent 6 hours trying to restart a system they had never fully understood, restoring surface-level dashboards while the actual scheduling core sat dead beneath them, a problem they didn't have the historical context to even diagnose. It was Ethan who finally sat down at 3 a.m. in the empty server room, alone except for one junior technician holding a flashlight, and began tracing the failure back through 11 years of his own code, layer by layer, the way only the person who had built something from nothing could possibly do. He found it in under 2 hours, a single deprecated authentication handshake, quietly left unpatched in an Ironbridge migration script that had finally expired and taken the entire scheduling core down with it. He didn't gloat. He didn't say a single word about being right. He simply began writing the patch by hand, describing each step calmly to the junior technician beside him, so that someone else would understand it this time, so that no single person would ever again be the sole thing standing between the company and collapse. By dawn, 3 of the 4 plants were back online, running smoother than they had in the entire 30 days since Ethan left, and the 4th came back by mid-afternoon, once a corrupted backup log was rebuilt from an offline archive Ethan had insisted years earlier on maintaining exactly for a moment like this one. Marcus Doyle, cornered by his own migration documentation, which now clearly showed the unpatched handshake under his team's ownership, tried at first to reframe the failure as a legacy vulnerability inherited from the prior system, the same smooth language he'd always used, until Charlotte, standing in the same war room where the crisis had begun, asked him directly, in front of the assembled leadership team, whether Ironbridge had ever actually reviewed the failover documentation Ethan had left behind before declaring it obsolete. Marcus had no answer that didn't expose him. Within the week, Ironbridge's contract was formally terminated, and the story of what had actually happened, not the sanitized version, but the true one, began moving quietly through the company the way true stories eventually always do, whispered first, then spoken plainly, until everyone from the factory floor to the boardroom understood exactly whose hands had actually saved Halbrook Industrial. Charlotte found Ethan alone in the server room that evening, still there long after his official consulting hours had ended, quietly double-checking a redundancy log that wasn't even his responsibility anymore. She didn't offer him a title this time. She sat down on the floor beside him, in her tailored suit, on the cold tile, and asked him honestly how he had managed to stay so calm through all of it, through being pushed out and then called back in to clean up someone else's mess without a single complaint. Ethan considered the question for a long moment before answering that anger had never once fixed a broken system, only clear thinking had, and that he'd learned a long time ago, the hard way, that the people who shout the loudest are rarely the ones actually holding anything together. Charlotte realized, sitting there, that she had spent 14 months surrounded by people who spoke confidently about problems they didn't understand, and that the quietest man in the building had been the only one who actually understood everything. 2 weeks would pass before the board called an emergency meeting to decide, publicly, what Halbrook Industrial owed the man it had so carelessly let go, and neither Charlotte nor Ethan yet knew that the answer to that question would end up reshaping far more than just his job. Title: The board meeting was held in the same war room where the system had first gone dark, and Charlotte insisted, against the advice of legal, that Ethan be there in person rather than represented by a memo. She stood at the head of the table, in front of the same board that had once applauded her decision to modernize, and told them plainly that Halbrook Industrial had nearly destroyed itself by mistaking confidence for competence, and that the reason 4 factories were running again was the same man they had pushed out 34 days earlier over a consultant's slide deck. She did not soften it. She did not protect herself. She told the room that the failure had been hers, not the board's, not Ironbridge's alone, but a decision she had made out of fear rather than judgment, and that she was recommending Ethan Brooks be reinstated not as a favor, but because the company literally could not function without the kind of understanding only he possessed. The board, chastened and still shaken from the crash, offered Ethan his old title back, a substantial settlement, and a public statement crediting him by name in the company's next shareholder letter. Ethan declined most of it. He asked for no public statement, no settlement beyond fair payment for his consulting hours, and no return to a full-time desk on the 40th floor. What he asked for instead was smaller and larger at the same time, a formal, permanent protocol requiring that any future infrastructure change be reviewed by someone with direct historical knowledge of the underlying system before it could be approved, so that no engineer's decade of quiet expertise could ever again be erased by a slide deck and a signature. He asked that his old failover documentation be formally archived and taught to at least 2 junior engineers, so the company's memory no longer lived inside one man's head. And he asked quietly that Renee Alvarez, who had finally found the courage to speak up when it mattered most, be given a formal role in the system's oversight process, since she'd shown more integrity in one evening than an entire consulting firm had shown in a month. The board approved all of it without debate. The quiet coda came 3 months later, on a Saturday afternoon, when Charlotte drove out to Brooks Repair not as CEO but simply as herself, and found Ethan underneath the same generator he'd been fixing the day. She first walked through his door, Lily now doing homework at the counter instead of working it, a small hand-painted addition beneath the shop's original sign reading "and consulting, too." Charlotte sat on an overturned bucket beside him, the way she'd once sat on cold server room tile, and asked him what he thought real worth actually looked like, after everything. Ethan wiped his hands on the same old rag, and told her that worth was never about the size of the title or the volume of the meeting. It was about whether the thing you built was still standing when nobody was watching, and whether the people you loved still felt steady because of you. Charlotte, who had spent 14 months chasing a version of strength that turned out to be mostly noise, understood then what she hadn't understood the day she fired him. Their partnership, born out of crisis and honest apology, deepened slowly over the following year into something neither of them had expected: quiet dinners after long consulting days. Lily eventually asking Charlotte, without embarrassment, whether she was going to be around for good. And 18 months after that Thursday morning, when 4 factories went dark at once, Ethan Brooks and Charlotte Reed were married in the small backyard behind the repair shop, with Lily standing beside her father instead of a wedding party, holding the same wrench she'd once used to hand him tools on Saturday afternoons. If there's one thing this story asks of you, it's this. Think for a moment about someone in your own life who was quietly overlooked, dismissed, or pushed aside before anyone bothered to really understand what they were actually holding together. A coworker, a parent, a neighbor, someone whose steady, unglamorous work never got the credit it deserved. Was there someone like that in your life? Someone you maybe misjudged before you saw who they really were? Tell us about them in the comments, even if it's only now, years later, that you're finally ready to give them the credit they always deserved. And if you believe, the way we do, that quiet, overlooked people are so often the ones actually holding everything together, consider staying with us, subscribing to be part of this family of stories, because there are so many more overlooked heroes still waiting for their moment to finally be seen. Thank you for staying until the very end. The truth, as it so often does, was worth the wait.